Welcome, folks, to 52 Living Ideas. And today is Wednesday, so it is Comprehensivist Wednesday. And I'm delighted to have my friend CJ talk about the necessities and impossibilities of being a comprehensivist. Take it away.
Thank you, Shrikant. We've got an exciting schedule. I'm particularly interested to see the people presenting in the end of September as we open it up to more feedback from people. Comprehensivism is a term that's new to a lot of people, so I wanted to briefly introduce it again. One can think of it as comprehensive comprehensions. So it has this notion of comprehensive. Comprehensive reports are broad and deep, and comprehension, understanding thoroughly. But our topic tonight is the necessities and impossibilities of comprehensivism. Now, I want to start in this first part with the necessities. Let's consider what way or ways of knowing ought a human being practice. What is the proper way of knowing? That is, what approach to learning, or the fancy word is epistemology, ought we practice? Let's start with the plausible assumption that humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action encompass all that is humanly knowable. Which of these many traditions of inquiry and action might provide the most reliable understandings? We could speculate, we could guess, we could simply pick the one that we became enamored with at an impressionable age. Or we might pick what a teacher, a friend, a loved one, what they prefer. But I'm afraid to say each of these would be a premature jumping to conclusions. Instead, I would offer a systematic approach. Consider this: incrementally explore more and more of humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action. By ever widening our circle of learning, our assessments will gradually become ever more comprehensive. This is the approach of comprehensivity, the state or quality of pursuing comprehensive comprehensions comprehensively, that is, across all our traditions. As we learn each new tradition, it will whet its discriminative edge against the others to sharpen and make more robust our own personal, ever-emerging way of knowing, our personal comprehensivity. By integrating more and more wisdom from each thoroughly considered way of knowing, we structure the context and perspective needed to better assess the value of other ways of knowing. By degrees, we organize an ever more refined, integrated synthesis. We build what amounts to our understanding of the world and of each other. In sum, comprehensivism is a systematic way of learning from our great traditions. It is a systematic approach to knowing, or to epistemology. And if a systematic approach is the most proper, then comprehensivism is the most proper epistemology, the proper way of knowing and learning. In that case, comprehensivism is a necessity. Secondly, now let's consider what way or ways of acting in the world ought a human being practice? What is the proper way of acting in the world? To act effectively in the world requires that we understand how the world works well enough that we have some hope that our actions will have our intended effects. That is, proficient acting in the world depends upon our knowing, our learning, and our epistemology, which we've just determined is most properly pursued by comprehensivism. So, if effective acting in the world is the most proper, comprehensivism is again a necessity. For the third necessity of comprehensivism that I'll highlight tonight, let's consider a quote from R. Buckminster Fuller in his book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, which is going to be the topic of our October 14th event. Quote, "We have not been seeing our spaceship Earth as an integrally designed machine, which, to be persistently successful, must be comprehended and serviced in total." End quote. Must our world system be comprehended and serviced in total in order to successfully provision and steward our global ecosystems, our value systems, our material and energy supplies, our social systems, all in support of a thriving population of nearly 8 billion crewmates, and to do so on a regenerative basis for millennia to come? If humanity does not comprehensively comprehend these world systems adequately enough to anticipate possible disruptions, to ensure proactive and effective management of the entire world system on an ongoing basis, who will? God, the divine Stoic principle of right action in the moment? Should we delegate it to luck and chance? What guarantor for the destiny of spaceship Earth would you propose? It might be that comprehensivism, collaboratively pursued, is the only approach that is systematic enough to be able to provision a makeshift patchwork that passively supports the ongoing regenerative functioning of the entire world system. In that case, comprehensivism seems to me to be a necessity for managing that entire world system on an ongoing and a regenerative basis. So those are my three necessities for knowing and learning, for acting in the world, and for making the entire world system work. And so what we're going to do is Q&A and then breakouts, right?
Yes. So folks, to ask questions, so we've got 4 rules to make possible really intense conversation. Number 1, to ask question, type an exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but do so courteously. All right, so with that, Joe, you're up next.
Hi, CJ, and thank you for presenting this evening. It was awesome. Is comprehensivism, would you say it's a scientific approach, or is it an artistic? Or as you had mentioned, is it a stoic with a moral approach? I mean, or is it all of these in the sense that you're developing a systematic framework on how to like kind of address each one of these areas?
I don't know who gets to police the boundaries of what is art, what is science. Um, you know, if science is systematic and thorough, then in my view, comprehensivism, this aspiration to ever more and more thorough, comprehensive, broad, deep comprehension on many, many traditions of knowing and learning would be systematic. And maybe we want to define science as that which is systematically thought through. Maybe systematic is reserved for philosophy. I mean, who gets to police these things? For me, there's a scientific aspect. There's an art to it. Morality, yeah, there's certainly a morality there. The way I presented these necessities is as a moral calling of sorts, that if you really want to know and learn about the whole world, you should be systematic about it, not just pick the thing you learned as an impressionable youth that happened to catch your fancy and that you now police that discipline. Maybe you're a scientist or a theologian, and that's the only way you see it.
Next question is from Jairo. Jairo, go ahead.
So it sounds like this is an ought that ought to be done in order to continuously provide the survival of the planet and the creatures and humanity, to keep it stable. Like, we have to bring together all kinds of traditions, and that includes sciences and treat cultures as also traditions and religions as traditions. Kind of bring them all together, bring them to the table, and get the best minds from all of them to be working on kind of keeping everything going forward harmoniously. Is that what
that's my proposition. My proposition is that we need to have a comprehensive approach to the entire world system. That the world system is so complex that no single subject, no single discipline, no single tradition has all the answers. And the idea comes from Buckminster Fuller that we need to see our entire planet as an integrally designed machine, which must be comprehended and serviced in total. If he's right about that, then comprehensivism is the learning system that will allow you and me to work together to better ensure the operating of the world. What other options do we have? We're going to put it in the UN's hands or the President of the United States? I mean, I think we need a broader system of learning.
All right. Are there any more questions? So let me ask one question, and your questions take preference over my questions. So, so when you look at you talk about multiple comprehensivist traditions. So what is it that is common to all the comprehensivist traditions? Because you talk about a wide range of traditions, and you refer to a wide range of traditions by saying that they are comprehensivist traditions. So what makes these traditions comprehensivist, and what's the variety and what is the commonality in them?
Well, the commonality would be a tradition, as I see it, is communicable. It's developed by one or more founders, and they may be unknown individuals. Who knows who started chemistry? I mean, you know, it merges in the myths of alchemy. And tradition is something that is passed on, it's taught. In order to teach it, you need to communicate it. Not all ideas can be expressed in words. Some of them require image or acting or mime or, you know, there are other ways to communicate besides talking and writing and all. So I would say the commonality is some form of communication and some tradition. You know, some people might say, well, what about the animals? Sure, ethologists have learned how to talk to animals in the animal's own language. So that gets included. Let's see, what was the other aspect you were getting at?
Just the range. I think you have answered it pretty well. I think there are two more questions in the line. I'm always going to give preference to people asking questions. So it's going to be Doug followed by Merrill. Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one comment and a question, which I think we've talked about in the past, but maybe not exactly. Bucky's definition of a system is something that has an inside and an outside, and that which separates inside from outside, which is actually a boundary or a border. And in thinking about that, it seemed like borders have to be porous to be healthy. They need to let in some things, and you know, if they're frozen, then it's kind of a dead organism. But I'm curious how you see that applying to this approach to comprehensivism, because I think to deal, the other question I think that Bucky said is that we have to depend on the integrity of the individual to look at the microcosm and the macrocosm, and then those will synergetically cooperate with each other. But it demands citizens be educated, I think, in comprehensivism. So I'm curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, so the system idea, I think, operates more at the level of a tradition or even below a tradition. What I'm more trying to do with comprehensivism is throw in Bucky's concept of universe. If you saw my video from 2 weeks ago where we talked about humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action, I included experience as one of my 4 pillars. And as you know, Doug here is a great Bucky scholar, or student, I should say. And universe is the aggregate of all experience, and so effectively my notion of traditions of inquiry and action is Bucky's idea of universe. I've just chosen different words that I hope are less controversial than maybe Bucky's, where you get into this battle of what is universe, and people say, well, what if we're in a multiverse? The other aspect of your question was the individual integrity. And that's something I'm really trying to preserve. And I think that gets at Shrikant's question a moment ago. I'm really trying to make my vision of comprehensivism, and other people here might have other visions. I think each of us should have our own individual vision. In my positioning of comprehensivism, I want to accommodate every possible individual's integrity. I guess even if they're a Nazi, although I would hope there aren't too many of them. But if we're going to really go radical, as I think Bucky does, and include the integrity of every individual, we need to include the integrity of every individual. And so that's why I'm trying to have this very big tent of comprehensivism that accommodates all humanity's traditions of inquiry and action, so that each individual's integrity is central.
Can I ask one other question?
Please go ahead.
A follow-up. In terms of the definition of universe, I think that is a mouthful to try to do. But he had another thing that was more poetic, where he said, environment is everything that's not you, and universe is everything including you. So the individual was important to connect to universe. It was essential, which is very American transcendentalist, I think, where every Bostonian thinks they're the center of the universe. And that's in fact what Bucky inherited from them, I think, in a good way. And so, but as an individual, the skin is the boundary between us and the outside world. And that lets some things in and keeps some things out. And that's, so the boundaries within boundaries, and every cell in our body is a system with an inside and an outside. And our lungs have an inside and outside. And our heart has an inside and an outside. And the boundary on the heart is where a lot of infection takes place. So, I mean, I find this a very productive thing. So have you thought much about that definition of universe, everything including you, versus the environment, which is everything that's not you?
I like that, but I don't, I'm finding this framing in traditions of inquiry and action and trying to comprehensively comprehend an ever-widening circle as it's my intuition, I could be wrong, it's my intuition that that will hopefully inspire and engage more participants to jump in and find what their integrity is about, and all hands on deck kind of idea. In my philosophical modes, yes, I love that poem by Bucky on environment, cosmic plurality. That's one of my favorites, but it's not the framing that I felt for engaging participants to join us on this journey to understand the world, how it works, and each other. I didn't think that framing, contributed. So thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, CJ. Next up is Meryl.
Okay, so I'm hearing about comprehensivism for the first time, and I wondered, is it like a curriculum with a starting point, and then you branch off from there, or where do you start learning in this system? What's the framework?
Well, I don't have a correct, well, I have my path, and the path that I have outlined with Shrikant for my contributions to this series of Comprehensivist Wednesdays. On the Collaborating for Comprehensivism website, which I started late last year, I argue that there is no tradition of comprehensivism yet. Buckminster Fuller said, I'm a comprehensivist, and that made all the difference because I had no competition. He used it sort of as a joke to say no one else does it, and you can go to Buckminster Fuller, and he did a 40-hour Everything I Know video series, and you could take that as the curriculum. But what we're doing with Comprehensivist Wednesdays is an experiment. neither Shrikant or I know how to really do comprehensivism and how to build this tradition. So we've just said, let's start and we'll find out what works. And as I was explaining to Doug a moment ago, I really think the individual's choice is essential. And in part 2 of this, we'll get into that more. If you stay to the end, I'll have more to say about how the individual can choose their own path. And I would submit that the individual path is more significant than having a set curriculum that we might learn at university. I don't think universities are prepared to teach this.
Thank you, CJ. Next up is Sanjay. You had a comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just made a comment on what Doug and CJ were talking about as far as systems. And in engineering and the sciences, the concept of system is something that is defined on the fly. It's based on the problem or the situation that you're trying to address. So it typically does include an inside and an outside, but it is possible to include the entire universe as a system. So basically, we define this, what we mean by system, as we need it defined.
Yeah. You can define universe that way, but Bucky's definition of universe is the aggregate of all experience, or in my terms, the aggregate of all humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action, which includes Aunt Martha's tradition of epistemology, Aunt Becky's, tradition of gladiola growing. I mean, it's an aggregate of aggregates, and it's human-centered. It's all of our experiences, and experience is a polymorphic word. It's a word that, your parsing of experience may differ from my parsing of experience. So I would suggest that if you want universe in the mathematician's sense as the set of all possible ways of knowing, and that's the way I'm trying to think of it. It's an aggregate of aggregates that's an uncountable list that defies systems thinking, although everything within it is a system. So I think of universe as sort of outside systems thinking.
Yeah, so I think, that's consistent with the way I also look. If we look at it from the point of view of physics, physics and famous Stephen Hawking's mentioned this several times, that all information and all energy is a part of the universe. And information is another way of representing what you're calling, a person's, conceptually, how we do things, what we know, that's all a form of information, as well as how we learn. That's also a procedural type of information. So I think it is similar, but we have to, understand that that's included as part of the universe.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, it's time to start breakout rooms. CJ, you want to describe what you want people to do in the first breakout rooms? But before that, let me just give people an overview of the entire structure of the meetup. So CJ made the first presentation, then we did Q&A. We're going to do breakout rooms for about 25 minutes. Then we're going to come back. Automatically, we'll come back in this main room. CJ will do the second part of the impossibilities part of the presentation. Again, Q&A, again, breakout rooms, and then we come back. And then everybody will be able to share their takeaways from this meetup. So that's the plan. All right, CJ?
So for breakouts, I would like in your breakout, Shrikant, can we do 6 or 7 people in breakouts
Yes,
or
around 7 people in the breakouts.
7? Okay. So in your group of 7, go around and discuss, do you agree that my first necessity, forming a proper way, a comprehensivism, is a proper way of knowing? It's a necessity because it's, quote unquote, the proper way of knowing. Secondly, that second necessity was that comprehensivism is necessary for a proper way of acting. And the third necessity was that comprehensivism is necessary for managing the total world system on an ongoing and regenerative basis for millennia to come. Your question is, are each of these compelling necessities for our practice of comprehensivity, for your practice of comprehensivity?
Wonderful. So with that, I'm opening up the breakout rooms now. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Is CJ, are you back?
Yes, I just unmuted.
Okay, wonderful. So CJ, it's time for the second part of the presentation.
Yes, so I hope everyone has gotten some sense that...
Just a second, CJ, there is a crackling sound in your audio. That is better. That is better now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I muted and unmuted. That's something to learn. I hope everyone has gotten some sense that maybe there's a necessity for comprehensivism. And if so, you know, we should pursue it a little more diligently if it's a necessity, right? Now let's consider the impossibilities of comprehensivism. And also, I'm going to end with some thoughts about the practice of comprehensivism. We've considered 3 necessities for our comprehensivity that call for us to gain an ever more comprehensive survey of the full inventory of humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action. However, it is numerically impossible for any one finite human being to thoroughly explore each and every tradition. Indeed, it is not even possible to list out each one that's available. So, a comprehensivist must humbly submit to understanding but a small subset of humanity's complete cultural heritage. But this is just a trivial impossibility for comprehensivism. Let's now turn our attention to the much more challenging and dangerous pathologies of comprehensivity that are identified by Harold G. Nelson and Eric Stolterman in their book, The Design Way. First, they warn us of analysis paralysis. When our need and desire for understanding it all results in endlessly gathering more and more information without a means for convergence on an effective way to manage our initiatives and projects, analysis paralysis is apt to frustrate our objectives. Analyzing all available information seemed to be a requirement for comprehensivism, but in fact, it is an impossibility. The second impossibility is value paralysis. When our need and desire for integrating everyone's value systems into our comprehensive inquiries and actions without an effective way of transcending their mutual ambiguities and contradictions, value paralysis is apt to frustrate our objectives. It seemed to be that accommodating all value systems in our comprehensive comprehensions was a requirement for comprehensivity, but in fact, it is an impossibility. Third, the paralysis of holism. When our need and desire for integrating the full context of every system we are considering into a big picture, when we do that without an effective means to limit or contain our survey, the paralysis of holism is apt to frustrate our objectives. It seemed that fully assembling our understandings of the world into a whole seemed to be a requirement for comprehensivism, but in fact, it is an impossibility. These three pathologies of comprehensivism make it clear it is impossible. But we've also seen that it's a necessity. In order to understand the world, in order to understand the whole world system and make the world work, we need this comprehensivity. Here's how Buckminster Fuller laid it out. The more, quote, the more we know, the more mysterious it becomes that we can and do know both ought and naught. Ought is an old-time word that means anything, and naught means nothing. So Bucky is saying that the mystery is that we can and do both know anything and nothing. This paradox lies at the heart of comprehensivism. I would suggest it's the creative source of its genius. We can come to know anything. Simultaneously, our profound and inescapable ignorance will forever remain palpable, reminding us to stay sober and humble in our assessments. The necessities of comprehensivism beseech us to practice the art more assiduously, to learn about it and practice it. While its impossibilities remind us, I would submit, of the importance of cultivating a humble but incisive judgment so that we can boldly navigate into the complexities of our objectives more effectively. When dealing with ambiguous, contradictory, and paradoxical injunctions, such as the necessities and impossibilities of comprehensivism, our best, and maybe it's our only instrument for measuring, is our judgment. The evaluations, assessments, and interpretations that form our judgment, I would suggest, are the key to an effective practice of comprehensivity. We need to judge when to diverge and widen our circle of learning, and when to converge and hone in on a defined subject until we thoroughly comprehend it. We need to judge when we need to gather more information and when we need to integrate what we already have. We need to judge which value systems we can integrate into this project and which we need to leave aside for the moment. We need to judge if our big picture is a good enough whole, or if more context is needed. The unique human measuring rod of interpretation, assessment, and judgment may be all you have to guide you on your circle of learning, on your path to comprehensivity. If you aspire diligently to the necessities of comprehensivity while heeding its impossibilities, your judgment is the tool that measures your way of knowing and doing, that forms your comprehensivity. So may you judge well and learn enough from each of your inevitable mistakes. Q&A.
All right, folks. If you have questions, Jean, go ahead. You can go first.
I wanted to know whether, CJ, you had considered the possibility that there was an underlying assumption of one person dealing with this versus the group, versus the humanity group. Are we alone, in your view, in our subjectivity and our perceptions, or is there a group phenomenon here?
I'm trying to play to both. I'm trying to appeal to each participant as an individual, and I'm recognizing that our learning, our knowing is really social, and that especially to address the world system as a whole, which I'm suggesting comprehensivity is important for, no one individual can know enough to suppress the pandemic. We need to collaborate, and we need to collaborate with people that are comprehensive enough that we have enough understanding about how all the complexities of human social systems, of biologicals, of everything that it takes, the region supplies for a vaccine or what, all this needs to be taken into account. So I'm trying to appeal to both, Jean.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm glad to hear it, because we are interdependent, as you know.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. So now, folks, you can ask the questions by just typing an exclamation mark in chat or raising your hand in Zoom. So CJ, let me ask, again, everybody else's questions take priority over mine. Wait a minute. Doug, go ahead.
It wasn't a question. I just typed something in that Bucky's comment that unity is plural and at minimum two. So I think that I found that very useful, that the one requires the many. I think is important. I thought also in this of Jung's idea of marriage as a crucible, that it's brutal, but you learn things in that crucible of marriage that you wouldn't learn on your own about yourself and the rest of the world. That's a very fertile idea, I think. Any group process can be brutal.
Yeah, both those ideas are profound. I mean, I'm more familiar with Jung than Bucky. And Doug, it would be wonderful if you would come and give us an overview of Bucky, because though CJ's group is very familiar with Bucky, my group is not. So I would love it. I know that CJ is going to talk about it in October, but I hate to wait till October to discover. So if you're up for it, we can schedule a Sunday or something like that. And you can give an overview of Bucky's thought for people who are not familiar with him. That will be wonderful.
What was the date that you said you had free?
Sundays, any Sunday. Any Sunday at 12 o'clock or 12:30 on Sunday.
That's New York time.
Yeah,
Doug's in
sorry, yeah,
California.
Eastern time, yeah.
So that would be 9:30. Yeah, that would
Yes.
probably work for me.
Okay, so I'll be in touch with you, and we'll plan something. Also, I want to briefly say that you know, I studied Carl Jung. We did a 13-part series on different Jungian psychoanalysts talking about different concepts of Carl Jung. And it has the same kind of feel that CJ is talking about. On the one hand, there is a concept of self, which occupies all of you. And then there is a concept of ego, where that is your conscious. And Jung is all about saying that there is self. Don't forget that. At the same time, you're trying to expand your consciousness to include more of it. And it's a never-ending quest of individuation. So, so with that, next person up is David. David, go ahead.
Right. I had a little framing on the question I wanted to do, which is, and I'm sorry I was late because I was in a different group, but this question may still make sense because I did read the write-ups, read about it. Are there, let's say there are some areas of decision, discipline, reflection, and action that do not require comprehensivism because they are, you know, in a sense already sort of successful, useful tools, developed areas. Does that in any way add into the question of the comprehensivism? When is it applicable, right? I mean, it maybe if we're talking about in life in general, comprehensivism makes sense. Is there a framework where, well, you don't need comprehensivism within this because it's a single tool, but comprehensivism is about something where there are undetermineds, where there's lack of information, where there's uncertainty?
Well, the way I'm positioning comprehensivism, I think it accommodates even the specialist. I'm trying to say that you know, even a specialist, if you're a specialist and you're going in depth on something, you're bringing in more and more considerations, more and more ideas. You know, there is some evidence. Angela Codalesa will be talking about this next week, that such a specialist, by studying some Dante or Buckminster Fuller or Carl Jung, or you know, might get an idea for their particle physics or something. You know, from what I've read of Angela Codalesa's research, those specialists that are broadly attuned can bring in ideas and tend to be more creative in their specialties than those who, you know, never cracked a book of poetry and are just trying to do it within the confines of whatever narrow specialization they took on. Yeah. But in my formulation, it's individual judgment whether you should go deeper or whether you should go into another subject area. And I'm trying to encourage people to consider, if you really, I said 2 weeks ago, if you really want to bring your comprehensivity forward quickly, the way to do that is to explore traditions that you know nothing about. If you're a mathematician, maybe it's time to study Dante's poetry. If you're a poet, maybe it's time to study multivariable calculus. You know, we by pushing ourselves into traditions of inquiry and action that we know very little about, we're sure to get a cross-breeding of ideas that will be far more powerful than if we just decide our next round of learning is going to be you know, one more math course that's slightly different, and you know, and you're broadening your math knowledge, but you're not really broadening your comprehensivism to the same extent. But I'm trying to let each individual do what their individual initiative and judgment and assessment wants. And, you know, although I'd like to take a stand for the comprehensive, broad approach, who am I to say until we find out whether a narrow specialist might be the one that saves the world? We don't know. So why should we limit that? Let's let each individual decide.
Thanks.
Thank you, CJ. Next up is Joe, Maxine, and Sanjay. Joe, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask for a little bit of clarification on the second one with values paralysis. Can you give me a little bit more detail as to what that actually means? Because I'm struggling with how that and judgment fit with one another.
Well, so in anything we do, and even in our learning and knowing, we have values. Joe and I have been studying this book called Objectivity by Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. And in that book, the way of knowing of Goethe and Linnaeus, these scientists of the 1700s, was a way of knowing that valued integrative knowledge. And then in the 1800s, there was this, there were so many of these integrative ideas, these Goethean kinds of ideas, that each month in the journal, there'd be another theory that overthrew the previous theory. And yeah, Objectivity is the name of the book, Doug. In objectivity, you have a value of seeing exactly what happened, and not integrating this into an Erfland's big pure phenomena abstraction into the species and genera. So even in knowledge systems, you have values. And, you know, in human systems, we have values. You know, we have all sorts of values. But another way, as I was preparing this, thinking someone might ask this question, I was realizing that every word we use, every word choice is a value. You know, do we, I was editing something with someone recently and said, you know, what was it? There was a militaristic word they used, I can't remember it. You know, and I said, there's a synonym that's less militaristic. Let's use that. So value systems at the word now, as you're trying to do a project, as you're trying to learn a new tradition of inquiry and action, or maybe you're trying to solve one of these global total world system problems like climate change or the coronavirus pandemic or the economic collapse caused by the coronavirus, you know, you've got a big system. And can you really integrate all the libertarian ideas and all the big state socialist ideas and include them all and get everyone around the table and solve that problem? Well, you're going to have some fighting if you do that. You're going to need some way to transcend the contradictions and whatnot, or you're going to run into value paralysis. I hope that helps.
Thank you,
CJ.
CJ.
The book was very helpful. Thank you.
Next up is Maxine, followed by Sanjay. Maxine, go ahead.
Okay, well, I can understand when you said explore new things, go into new areas, not in your comfort zone. But when do you go into the world and try to get to the third thing? I mean, how do you enter the world with the new things that you've explored or with your old things?
Well, that's your choice, your initiative. You get to decide when you need to explore more and when it's time to get into action and build a solution. Who are you going to collaborate with? Are you going to do it on your own? In the framework I'm trying to outline, the individual has to interpret the situation and decide, what do I need? Do I need a collaborator? Do I need more information? Do I need to build a whole? Do I need to include more value systems? Do I need to exclude some values? You know, this is the plight of being human. You know, we have all these possibilities, and no one's figured out how to do judgment, interpretation, and assessment in computer software. We can gather a lot of data and we can do all sorts of statistical analyses on it, but how do you decide? You know, there's no algorithm for the computer to decide, you know, the data you fed me is inadequate. We need to go out and get better data, and this is the kind of better data we need. You know, those judgments is the way humans measure whether it's time to act or time to study. And I think we each have to judge our own situation. Oh, you're muted, or it's delayed or something.
That's okay. Then do we leave behind what we knew before and just start anew with our explanations, or do we build on what we had before?
Well, I think we're always building. Sometimes you might decide that, you know, I need to unlearn that. Unlearning is an important part of learning. I really think it comes down to the individual. I would submit the individual has to choose, that I can't choose for you.
All right. Next up is Sanjay, followed by Hiro. Sanjay, go ahead.
So I want to ask about, this is related to what David was talking about earlier. So we've talked about that the generalist approach helps with comprehensivism, that it's definitely essential because it helps us to broaden into areas that we're not familiar with or we may not be interested in. We've also mentioned that the specialist approach adds depth to our comprehensivism. So the question I'm asking is, why shouldn't we strive for both? And there's a quote that Bucky used. I'm not sure if I have this exactly correctly, but micro-inclusive and macro-expansive. So to me, that's basically what that says, is using both a generalist and specialist approach.
Yes, I agree. We need both.
Thank you. Next up is Hiro. Hiro, go ahead.
Yes, so how to overcome the pushback that could be coming from various sectors of society that are convinced, perhaps through social media or misinformation, that there's a cabal out there of technocrats that are wanting to take over the world and enslave us, and through the vaccine, they'll have a chip in us and will keep track of us and things like that. So you're saying, that with collectivism and modeling the world as a spaceship, and it's so there's an outside of it and an inside, and so let's say we got it all modeled and figured out, and we figured out how to best maintain it and allow it to be fair and just and flourishing for all its creatures, and not let it just destroy itself. So it's a necessity, you say. So then how to implement that? Would it require like having a one world government of technocrats that have PhDs in collectivism?
Yeah. Well, that wouldn't be my preference. You know, we don't. I don't know the answer to that one. My belief is that in order to really manage the total world system, we first need to understand it. When we understand it, then my hope is that through collaborating comprehensivism, we can work together to find a way to solve it. But that's sort of a pipe dream, maybe. I have studied a little bit the work of Eleanor Ostrom. And this was precisely Eleanor Ostrom's concern. She won the Nobel Prize in economics in the late 2000s, and then she died in the early 2010s. So she didn't live very long after her Nobel Prize, but she left behind a brilliant legacy of work about how collaborations, groups of people can manage their resources. And one of her big findings was no panaceas. What she did as a researcher, she was a social scientist, political scientist, and they studied all the various, you know, kind of tragedy of the common situations all around the world. And what her big takeaway was, there are no panaceas. There's case study after case study after case study where when you let corporations manage your resources, they destroy it all. And there is caseload after caseload after caseload that when you let government manage all your resources and you give them total technocratic control, it destroys it all. What she discovered is the best way seems to be when you engage government, corporations, civil society, individuals, get everyone at the table, build a level of trust, and talk about the situation. And as I understand it, the people were smart enough that once we get all to the table and we start trusting those that our ideologies might have us at odds with, but when we do the work to build trust with those people and we start saying, okay, now we all realize that if this fishery disappears, the companies and the government are all gonna, and the fishermen are all gonna be upset. So how do we do this? And what Eleanor Ostrom also discovered is that there is fishery, water system, all these tragedy of the common situations. There are thousands of them around the world where people have successfully managed it for hundreds, thousands of years. And the ones that are successful are not the ones that rely on a government. They're not the ones that rely on individuals or companies. They're the ones that rely on a community of multi-level organizations sitting down, building trust, and figuring out how are we going to manage this resource so that we all get enough of it to thrive.
Thank you, CJ. Next up is Derek. Derek, go ahead. Derek, can you speak? You're unmuted.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I was muted for a second there. Hi, everybody. I'm new. But so comprehensivism is an idea I'm terribly familiar with, but from what I can tell, it seems to intersect with two different interesting things that I feel like either antagonize the idea of comprehensivism or bolster it. And the number one I'd like to ask you, CJ, is the idea of the gestalt, which is that a combination of things as a whole creates something new that is distinct from the parts. And it's something, I work in neuroscience research, so we do a whole lot of, you know, analysis at different levels of organization, and sometimes it does seem like the combinations of processes at lower levels end up producing something new at higher levels. And so in that case, does that mean that, you know, with comprehensivism, you have different things that interact with other things in what you could say are transient couplings or transient groupings? Would that mean that really to try to combine everything together, it turns it into something that the things apart are not? And is that something people have addressed? And would you think that that is something that antagonizes or supports the idea of comprehensivism?
Yeah, I think it supports it because it shows, to my mind, that the broad understanding of the pieces is essential for understanding emerging gestalts, or Buckminster Fuller used the word synergy. I really like the word gestalt. I've been reading Jan's Wiki. Jan's Wiki has an article out about the experience of meaning. There's a YouTube video. I'm planning to do events at the Thinking Society on Jan's Wiki's work on gestalts. And that, you know, the pathology, the paralysis of holism I talked about is talking about how we need this big picture. And that we sometimes can't get it because when we unlimitedly gather more and more context, our big picture stays out of focus. And the Gestalt idea and a little bit the synergy idea is how can we see what's going on at this emergent level without falling into the paralysis of holism. And there's the trick. And that's all I'm coming up with right now.
Okay, next up. Go ahead, Derek. Quick
I just have one more thing regarding this is a lot of what I've seen in cutting edge science these days is a heavy reliance on AI to be able to tackle problems of complexity that overwhelms, you know, the normal human psyche. But a lot of what ends up seeming to happen is we end up with this sort of black box scenario where you're putting in huge amounts of data and you're getting out results, and it's really like you're just trying to match things up so they make sense without understanding how the AI is actually achieving the results through either machine learning or other adaptive processes. And I was curious, like, so it's kind of like, all of this reminds me of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where they build a supercomputer to answer get the great answer to the universe, and the answer is 42, and they have to build a bigger computer to figure out what the question was to begin with.
Yeah. Let's save the AI for another discussion. There's a lot there. When I tried to suggest in my comments on the practice of comprehensivism that we need the measuring rod of human assessment, interpretation, and judgment, I would submit that no AI research that I've seen to date pretends to have an algorithm for assessment, interpretation, and judgment. They can do Bayesian analysis to get statistical probability distributions of all sorts of data, but how you interpret it, they don't know how to do that. You know, so AI is a powerful tool that can teach us a lot, but until we learn how to program judgment into computers, I don't think it's intelligence, and I think there's going to be a lot of room for humans to exercise judgment.
Thank you. Next up is David. David, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Second question. I'll try to keep it short. I wonder if you see how you see this falling within or without of the context of comprehensivism, a different idea, which is competitivism, where you don't take a comprehensivist approach, but you head off in a direction and expect to work with opposing forces, and the one that is most successful kind of in a competitive sense ends up, you know, with the first vaccine, with whatever. So in a sense, you get a sort of comprehensive result, not necessarily optimizing each one. But is that a play on comprehensivism or a dialectic, an opposite thing to comprehensivism? It's, you know, it's splitting apart and working on different ideas. Yeah.
I would suggest that the comprehensivism accommodates what you're calling competition, and you know, I go even further. I think it accommodates contradiction, paradox, and ambiguity. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons we've shied away from comprehensivism in the past, is we put Aristotle's law of non-contradiction at the forefront of our logic. And so, oh my God, there might be a contradiction there. Let's not go there. When I think we need to go into the contradictions. I don't know if a contradiction is quite competitive. It's competition, to my mind, is cooperative. It's like, you know, you're going to be on that side of the football and I'll be on the other side, and we're going to dance, and hopefully people will applaud. You know, that what, you know, and they get paid lots of money. I mean, you know, what could be more cooperative than that? But real competition, which is where you have an actual contradiction or paradox, that's the real fun of comprehensivism, is that you do run into, how do you get the atheist and the theologian to engage in collaborative comprehensivism? That's a little bit harder.
Wonderful. So with this, let's go to the second round of breakout rooms. So we'll be doing that for 25 minutes, and then we'll be coming back and everybody will get to share their takeaways. You'll have 2 to 3 minutes each to talk about your takeaways from this entire meetup. So CJ, you want to explain what you want people to do in the second breakout room?
Right. So for the second breakout, I'd like everyone to, you know, talk about whether they agree that the 3 pathologies I identified, analysis paralysis, value paralysis, and the paralysis of holism, are actually impossibilities. Do you agree that they are impossibilities that challenge our practice of comprehensivity? And a follow-in question, which I hope you take time to address, is how can you, in your practice, in our practice, however you want to look at it, reconcile these necessities and impossibilities in our practice of the art of comprehensivity? So You know, try to divide your time maybe in half. Spend a little bit on, are these impossibilities? Do you see that? Do you agree? And then move on to how do you reconcile it? Maybe my suggestions ring true for you. Maybe you need your own ideas. So explore that.
Wonderful. So with that, I'm opening up the breakout rooms now.
Sure.
Excellent. All right, welcome back, folks. All right, it's time now for takeaways. I'm going to go around and everybody gets to talk about their takeaways. I want to just tell you about what's coming up next. This Sunday, Doug Jacobs is going to give an overview of Buckminster Fuller's thought at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And then on Wednesday, it's going to be Angela who's going to be talking about polymaths in the 21st century. So that's what is coming up. So now I'm going to go around and have people talk about their takeaways. You get between 2 to 3 minutes. And you're not trying to recount everything that happened in the breakout room. You're trying to say, okay, what are you walking away with? Right? So I'm going to start with Meryl, Maritza, and Dave. If you want to skip, you can just type skip in the chat. All right, Meryl, go ahead. You need to unmute yourself.
My takeaway was that the impossibilities were not so much impossibilities as sort of guideposts as to not get to this point. Like the sign is saying, here's the exit, take the exit, don't keep going. So that was my takeaway.
Thank you. Next up is Marisa, followed by Dave.
I think I'm stuck at embracing contradiction. That's going to be my biggest takeaway from today, I think, is, and I see that as the bridge on how I would reconcile the necessities with the impossibilities. Thanks, CJ.
Thank you, Marisa. So next up is going to be Anita, followed by Joe.
Was I first? I'm sorry. You said Dave or not?
Oh, there was another Dave. Sorry, Dave. Dave, go ahead. Whichever Dave you are.
Okay, I'm David. Yes. Okay. We spent time looking at AI and examples so that we could really understand these three divisions of paralysis. And then we had 11 seconds left, and we had to overcome our paralysis. So I would say at that moment it occurred to me that when a group is working, trying to get in a direction, sometimes introducing or inducing arbitrary pressure to finish, to find deadlines, to up the stakes, and to really make the values and solutions compete, you know, is a kind of self-viewing and self-disciplining, and like using time limits is super powerful. So there's some kernel in there that talks about, for me, how you resolve the paralysis by saying the wall is coming.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Next up is going to be Anita, followed by Lisa. Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, so my takeaway from today is something I really liked what CJ said, is that if I'm in finance, then I should do like something artistic, you know, similarly vice versa, and that really helps to build comprehensivism. And again, this was a really new concept for me, and I'm really thankful the way he explained it well, and also discussions in the breakout rooms. So they were all really good.
Thank you, Anita. Next up is Lisa, Sanjay, and Arlene. Lisa, go ahead. Lisa, you need to unmute yourself.
My takeaway was mainly from your introduction of your information on your meetup, and it was collaborating for comprehensiveness, comprehensivism. So I'm going to check out that book. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Sanjay, followed by Arlene. Sanjay, go ahead.
So last week or last time, CJ described approximately 20 methods to use and choose from. for a comprehensivist, for comprehensive techniques. And one of those I think are very important because that's come up a few times already. And that's the notion of randomness, basically interjecting random methods or random approaches. I think that's very important, especially when you're stuck in a rut. So, you know, David talked about an example of that.
Thank you. Next up is Arlene, Joe, and Derek.
Yeah, I think in our group we explored a little about like the limits of where things become less effective. So it's great to like look at things that are orthogonal to what you already study. Of course, everybody should read widely, but in order to be effective, there tends to be natural limits. And we talked a little bit about magic numbers of companies working more effectively and army units working more effectively. And there is like a number of people that can get together in terms of how much they can understand each other and the relationship to each other, where things are effective and can be used for action. And then over that number, they become very ineffective and almost useless, like looking at the UN and things like that as well. There is a number where like it just no longer becomes effective.
Thank you, Arlene. Next up is Joe, Derek, and Maxine. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so thank you, CJ and Shrikant, for this evening. The two things I had also was going to take away with this is the importance of embracing contradiction, as Maritza had said, specifically as it pertains to guarding against absolutism and helps with dialogue. And the other thing is that maybe as a part of adding on to the necessities is not only having knowledge but understanding as another area to the three areas that were listed in between, what was it, action, acting, learning, and acting, systematic, and knowing. So understanding would be a fourth area that I would probably add into that. So thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Derek, Maxine, and Doug. Derek, go ahead.
So a lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about this paralysis, it reminds me a whole lot of creative blocks, in that when you're trying to do something creative, like make a piece of art, you're creating something that is sort of a holistic thing that occurs, that resonates at multiple levels. And so I think that a lot of people struggle a whole lot being able to sort of break the creative barrier and begin to create something new. And so I'm going to be looking into the parallels of that. And also, I'm still not sure that I fully agree on the distinction between human judgment and the kind of judgment that we see from AIs. So I'm going to want to look into that further this week and see what other thinkers have had to say regarding the distinction between the two, because I'm sure there's a body of work on that. But yeah, thank you, CJ, and thank you, Shrikant, for this. This was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek. Next up is Maxine, Doug, and Mike. Maxine, you need to unmute yourself.
All right, I want to thank you, CJ, because you always force me to think. And you force me to think in different fields and in different ways than I ordinarily would. As far as thinking this evening, I am not the kind of person that goes into paralysis. So I would take your first thing where analysis, yes, I would do that. I would skip paralysis. I would go to understanding, and I would set my goal then after I understood it a little better. Then I could go into reducing the impossibilities after I set my goal. But I I have to jump over paralysis. If I ever stopped for paralysis, I would never get to my goal.
Thank you, Maxine. Wonderful. Next up is Doug, Mike, and Sam. Doug, go ahead. Doug, you need to unmute yourself.
One of the things I'm taking away from this is, I think when I was in college, I used to say, you know, I have such an open mind, my brains are falling out. And so how do you stay open, and yet how do you find a path through that? Bucky's idea of sailing, I think, is really critical, that you can go against the current, you can sail against the current, you can use technology and deeper understandings to move, even to move in fresh directions. And so I think that individual agency is really important. He was also trained by the US Navy, which was at one point an extremely comprehensive approach, because if the captain got swept overboard in the old days, somebody else had to take over. And if he got swept overboard or died of plague, somebody else had to take over. So the Navy comprehensively educated people more than the Army or many other things. And I think that's a really important idea. But the other idea that I come up to escape the paralysis is what Bucky did when he quoted E. Cummings' advice to a poet, and what it means to be a poet as opposed to doing other things. And he describes it as very different, because you have to be in touch with your feelings. And if you're not in touch with your feelings, you start thinking like everybody else. And you start imitating the thoughts of others rather than rooting them to what your real root reality is. And that was the thing, I think, having two parents and a brother who influenced me, and probably to write the play, and I can talk about this on Sunday, is that they were so powerful. I didn't even know what I felt or thought about anything until I went into deep therapy and realized I was trying to track their thinking, which contradicted each other completely. They were all brilliantly contradicting each other. So until I could access my own feelings, I couldn't really know what I thought about anything.
Wonderful, Doug. I'm really looking forward to Sunday.
So that's sort of my takeaway. The other is localism, globalism. That division, I think, needs to be rethought completely.
Thank you. Next up is Mike, Sam, and Jairo. Mike, go ahead. Okay, next up is Sam.
I think I got it now.
Go for it.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay. To come up with a comprehensive solution is often very complicated because there's so many combinations and to consider, and it's almost impossible to consider all those. But there are techniques for considering them. One of the techniques, there's a concept called NP complete. So you know how you've considered all the possible combinations by implicitly enumerating them and dividing them into classes, and then eliminating the classes that categorizing them into ways that you can analyze them. Now that's often very complicated, and they talked about specialists. How do you get all your specialists working together when a problem is too big for any one person to understand? So the technique, artificial intelligence, which was mentioned, is one way of doing it. But what ends up going is there's a bunch of heuristics that are applied to this. They talk about things that are, Sanjay mentioned randomness, but the problems are random because we don't understand them. If you really understood them, they would be deterministic, because we live, even in the quantum mechanic world, we live in a deterministic world. But from where we sit, we can't do that. There's a lot more that can be said, but the short answer is you come up with a bunch of heuristics. And some of those heuristics are very formalized. There's something called Mill Standard 2167, which is A, B, C, D, and they're up to F now. And for getting a problem that's too big for any one person to get around, divided into suboptimal problems that can be solved. A lot more that can be said, but I'll yield the balance of my time once again.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Sam, followed by Iro.
So one thing that I take away is that in interdisciplinarism is crucial in knowledge and gaining more and more knowledge, and especially understanding. It was mentioned in one of our groups that and I mean, I'm sure we've all experienced that, like gaining knowledge of something else is kind of like clarifies or helps us gain kind of understand more deeply something else, some other different subject somewhere or something. So it all kind of works together, and it works hand in hand. And then it's important to determine a clear goal of comprehensivism, which is very complex, as Mike said. And so and we can determine our own individual goals but also just maybe branch out and determine some more broader goals. And right.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's that.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Next up is Hiro.
The takeaway for me is I like what CJ said about sort of coming together in communications between corporations, government, the workers and everything, the community, and that would solve a lot of things. Or he mentioned some studies about that.
Thank you.
And the other thing is that I liked is about what he said about competition. That there's a cooperation in it that I didn't think about. That it involves like a dance, like it has its own rules.
Thank you, Hiro. I mean, my takeaway was that I think analysis paralysis, or all kinds of paralysis at a conceptual level, idea level, can be avoided by action. If you are committed to acting on what you know, actually that is going to give you the feedback, crucial feedback that you need to kind of correct your ideas. If you say, I'm going to just sit down and try to figure out everything, that's going to cause you paralysis. But if you say, I'm going to come up with the best thing that I know, and I'm going to act on it, because action is a crucial part. I see kind of figuring things out and action, kind of inquiry and action as being a cycle. You can't really be on one side, because action without the inquiry is blind, and it's just going to run into walls. And inquiry without action is not going to go anywhere, even in terms of inquiry itself. So I think that is, to me, that I see is the solution. It's a rough and tumble way of proceeding, but I don't see any other way of proceeding. CJ, what are your takeaways? You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I really value that action and inquiry loop. That's crucial. I used in my presentation and in the essay it's based on the traditional bias in our educational system of knowledge as being the most important thing. But I really believe what you just said, Shrikant, that action and inquiry are intimately intertwined in a dance. You cannot have knowledge in a vacuum. And action is certainly part of the resolution of the impossibilities. I suggested that interpretation judgment was the other part. And I think it is, because it's a judgment what action you're going to take. It's a judgment what inquiry you're going to take next. So you need, you know, at the conceptual level, you need to balance your inquiry and your action. But at the judgment level, you need to choose which inquiry and which action. And so there, you know, there's no formula. This is human learning, not machine learning. There are no rules. We don't have an algorithm that tells us exactly how to do it. You can take a course, and maybe the professor will tell you, for this course, in our tradition of learning, you do it this way. But I like comprehensivism as embracing all traditions of human inquiry and action. I wanted to address a couple of thoughts. Derek was talking about judgment. And the resource that most influenced me about judgment is Harold G. Nelson and Eric Stolterman's book, The Design Way, which I can't recommend that book. I've recommended that book, and half the people that went off and bought it tell me that they make me regret the recommendation. This is not an easy book. It may not be a book for you. Get it from the library. Don't buy it until you you know, if you're my kind of person and you really want a hard book that you're going to wrestle with, you know, you'll be rewarded in spades. But if Derek wants a survey of judgment, the chapter on judgment in Nelson and Stolterman's book, The Design Way, is a fire hose of traditions of judgment through history. And you'll have more references than you can deal with. I wanted to, someone, I forget who, several people actually have mentioned, you know, they don't want to see the impossibilities as impossible. And neither do I. The impossibilities are not impossible. There are ways with our judgment and our action where we can avoid the impossibilities. But for emphasis, I want to explain one last time why I think they are impossibilities. In comprehensivism, I believe we are required to gather all the available information from all the fields. I mean, that's sort of the definition of comprehensivism. And yet, everyone, I think, can see that if if your project is whatever it is, and you're also studying the philosophy of the Pidaha and the philosophy of the Greeks and, you know, quantum mechanics, you know, it's analysis paralysis. You can't just gather information. There has to be judgment. There has to be action. There has to be some practice that's guiding you, whether it's randomness or something has to limit your scope. So the impossibility is when you believe, as I do, that comprehensivism wants to include it all, and you realize, regret, you know, I can't do that. And the value paralysis, I think people were seeing that you can't include everyone's contradictory values. But my vision of comprehensivism says all people form a tradition. You know, your tradition, my tradition, everyone's tradition should be included, accommodated, and integrated. But they contradict each other. It's an impossibility. We can't do that. So in my vision of comprehensivism, it is all inclusive of all people, and you're going to hit value paralysis unless you judge or act in some sophisticated way to avoid it. Paralysis of the whole, the big picture, forming a comprehensive comprehension is trying to get a big picture. But if we try to get a big picture by continually bringing in more and more context, it's going to continually get it more and more fuzzy. You're not going to be able to converge on a big picture if you do what my vision of comprehensivism says you ought to do. You ought to integrate everyone's ideas and form a whole, get the big picture of everything. And it's impossible. So that's what I meant. I meant that in our practice of comprehensivity, through judgment and action, we can become comprehensivists. But if we operate on the idea of comprehensivism in its ideal form, it takes us to these pathologies. So maybe I should leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, CJ. This was incredible. It's almost 11:30. So I think we should call it a night. What do you say?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Shravan.
See you back soon.
Thank you, CJ.